The first man grabbed the briefcase, the second pinned Sloane Harrington's arm against the car door, and the third planted himself between her and any possible exit. Dean Calder glanced once at the clock mounted above the hotel entrance. 8 seconds later, the briefcase was back in the CEO's hands. All three attackers were flat on the marble without a broken bone between them, and Dean was already checking Sloane's wrists for injury. She hadn't finished drawing breath to answer him when the lead attacker's phone lit up face-up on the pavement. Calder is faster than projected. Move to contingency 2. Stay until the end to find out whether Dean was protecting Sloane, the briefcase, or the secret that nearly destroyed his life. The Crown Halstead occupied 42 floors of glass and steel above the Chicago River, and on the evening of the Harrington Global Infrastructure Investor Conference, every corner of its grand ballroom had been arranged to project a single message. This company was not merely surviving, it was expanding. Sloane Harrington stood at the center of that message in a charcoal suit, preparing to announce a billion-dollar automated port project to a room full of people who had spent their careers deciding which version of success deserved their money. The room watched her the way rooms always watched her, with a particular mixture of calculation and admiration reserved for women who had inherited power and then had the audacity to grow it. Dean Calder was not watching Sloane. He was watching the room watch her, and what he saw had nothing to do with admiration. It was his third day on the job. 3 days since Sloane's previous security lead had resigned without explanation. 3 days since a consultant Dean had never met had passed his name to Harrington Global's legal department. And 3 days since Vaughn Maddox, the company's director of corporate security, had shaken Dean's hand with the particular firmness of a man who wanted to make clear that the handshake was a courtesy and nothing more. Dean had noted Vaughn's grip, the angle of his shoulders, and the way his eyes moved to the nearest exit when he thought no one was looking, the same way Dean's eyes moved, which meant either the man had genuine training or he was performing the memory of it. He hadn't decided which yet. What he had decided within the first 30 minutes inside the Crown Halstead was that 3 things were wrong. A black SUV had been idling in a no-stopping zone outside the service entrance. For 11 minutes, a catering staff member near the East Corridor wore a yellow access badge where everyone else wore blue, and one of the security cameras covering the lobby had been tilted 4 degrees off its mount, narrowing its field of view just enough to create a gap near the valet station. He had flagged all 3 to Vaughn. Vaughn had told him the SUV belonged to an off-duty detective moonlighting for a board member. The badge was a new vendor code he hadn't briefed Dean on yet, and the camera had been bumped during setup that morning. The explanations were plausible. Plausible was not the same as correct. Dean continued watching. He watched the 12 people who stood too close to the exits without drinks in their hands, the way professionals do when they want mobility rather than cover. He watched the 3 people along the back wall who had not moved in 22 minutes, despite the fact that there was an open bar 6 feet to their left. He watched a man near the center aisle raise his phone to take a photograph, and then he watched the man's camera angle. And what he saw made something in the back of his skull go very quiet. The man was not pointing his lens at Sloane. He was pointing it at the briefcase in Tessa Lane's hand. Tessa was Sloane's chief legal counsel, 37 years old, with the kind of precise movements that came from spending years choosing words in rooms where every word cost something. She carried the briefcase with a casualness that was almost too careful, the way people carry things they have decided not to draw attention to by the very deliberateness of their indifference. Dean watched her cross the ballroom and place the briefcase near Sloane's feet behind the podium. He radioed Vaughn about the photographer. Vaughn told him it was likely a financial journalist getting background shots. Dean did not respond because arguing over a radio before a threat materialized was a good way to look like a liability and a bad way to prevent anything. He moved instead, placing himself 3 steps closer to the podium and 2 steps closer to the door. 20 minutes later, when the conference wrapped and Sloane's team began collecting materials, Tessa pulled Dean aside with the kind of deliberateness that people use when they need to speak to someone without appearing to speak to them. She told him the briefcase contained documents that needed to reach a private meeting the following morning. She told him not to allow it to be handed off to the security detail or opened in the hotel. She told him the contents were the kind that would become a problem if the wrong person saw them before the right people had a chance to act. Dean asked who the right people were. Tessa said she would explain tomorrow. He asked what was inside. She said she needed him to trust her professional judgment. He said he didn't trust professional judgments he hadn't verified, and she looked at him for a long moment before deciding that was actually what she wanted in a person standing between Sloane and whatever she was afraid of. She told him just enough. The documents were an internal audit, and if they reached the board meeting without context, Sloane would be walking into a trap she had helped build without knowing it. Dean absorbed this without expression and returned to his position. When the conference ended and Sloane's team moved toward the lobby exit, Dean indicated the service corridor on his earpiece. Sloane shook her head without breaking stride and told him quietly that she was not going to walk out of her own company event through a kitchen because her new bodyguard had an overactive threat assessment. She said she had spent 15 years building an image, and she was not going to let it look like she was afraid of her own ballroom. Dean said the east entrance gave them a cleaner perimeter. She said the main entrance gave them better optics. He said the main entrance gave anyone watching them better optics too. She said, in the practiced tone of someone who had been ending arguments since boarding school, that was his job, not a decision to be shared. They walked toward the front entrance. Dean pulled out his phone and photographed 3 faces in the lobby that hadn't been there 40 minutes earlier, his thumb moving before his conscious mind had fully assembled the reason why. The 3 men were good. They were very, very good. They had separated just enough not to look like a group and had stayed just close enough to function as one. They were not watching the room. They were watching the briefcase. What happened in the 8 seconds after the lobby doors opened was less like a fight and more like a correction. The first man came in from Dean's left at a diagonal that was designed to look like an accidental collision, a technique used by people trained to create contact without appearing to initiate it, and Dean recognized it the way you recognize the opening line of a sentence you have heard before. He stepped into the contact rather than away from it, which is the opposite of the instinct most people follow, and exactly the right thing to do, because stepping away gives the other person the momentum, and stepping into it takes it from them before they have finished starting. The second man had the briefcase handle before the first man had fully registered that his distraction had not worked, and the third man had Sloane's left arm at the elbow and was already steering her toward the car door with the particular efficiency of someone who had rehearsed the geometry. Dean did not shout. He did not draw the weapon holstered beneath his jacket. He moved in a sequence that was less dramatic and more decisive than anything that looks like action in the movies, because real protective response is not about force, it is about position, and position is about where you put your body in relation to the person you are covering before anyone else in the scene has decided what to do next. He put his shoulder between Sloane and the man holding her arm. He applied pressure to the man's wrist at the angle that makes a joint comply without breaking, and he used the second man's own forward momentum, the lunging weight of someone already committed to a direction, to redirect him sideways into the side panel of the town car in a way that produced a loud noise and no permanent injury. The third man at the car door found the door closed on his arm when he had expected to open it, a small geometry of timing that left him briefly unable to move and entirely unable to continue. 8 seconds, possibly 9. The witnesses in the lobby would argue about it for weeks. Dean had Sloan behind the car's rear quarter panel inside the next 4 seconds, one hand on her shoulder blade, the other already on his radio calling a vehicle status check, because the one thing he needed to know before he let her get inside the car was whether anyone had touched the engine bay or the navigation system in the last 2 hours. She was breathing hard, not from exertion but from the particular adrenaline shock of a person who has never had violence happen within arm's reach of their own body, the shock of discovering that the abstract awareness of danger and the physical experience of it are two entirely different countries. She told him to let go. He kept his hand where it was for another 4 seconds, until he heard the driver confirm the vehicle was. Then he stepped back. Von Maddox arrived with 2 members of the security team approximately 90 seconds after the incident ended, which was long enough to be professionally useless and short enough to be technically present. One of the 3 attackers was sitting against the car wheel with his hands in front of him and his phone on the pavement beside him. The screen had lit up. Dean read the message before the police arrived. He read it twice. Then he crouched down, took a photograph of the screen, and stood up without touching the device. The police took the 3 men. Vaughn told Dean he had used excessive force. Dean said none of the 3 had a broken bone or a bleeding wound, and if Vaughn wanted to define the lower boundary of appropriate force in a 3-on-1 briefcase extraction scenario, he was welcome to file the paperwork. Sloan said nothing. She was looking at the phone on the pavement with the expression of someone who has just understood that the problem in front of them is significantly larger than the problem they thought they were managing. Dean read her expression and said nothing either. He waited. When the police had taken the attackers and the area had been secured, he pulled Sloan and Tessa aside and told them both what the message said. Tessa's face went still in the way that lawyers' faces go still when something confirms what they feared rather than revealing something new. Sloan asked what contingency 2 meant. Dean said he didn't know yet, but the fact that there was a contingency meant whoever organized the 3 men outside had expected one of them to fail, which meant whoever organized it had studied him. Then he picked up the briefcase to hand it back to Sloan, and felt, in the first half-second of lifting it, that the weight was wrong. The safe room on the 14th floor of the Crown Halstead was a windowless suite with reinforced walls and a keypad lock that had last been used for a diplomatic delegation 2 years prior. Dean had located it on his first walkthrough of the hotel on day 1, because locating safe rooms is the kind of habit that takes about 6 years of field work to build and about 2 seconds of field failure to make permanent. He sat the briefcase on the table. Tessa examined it for 40 seconds without touching the locks. She told them the serial number on the bottom left hinge was wrong, the number that had been on the original when she packed it that morning. She told them there was a hairline scratch on the left side of the magnetic seal that had not been there before. She picked it up and said the weight was 6 to 8 ounces lighter than it should have been. Someone had swapped the briefcase, not outside in the lobby during the altercation. The switch had happened earlier, which meant the 3 men in the lobby had never been trying to steal the real briefcase. They had been providing cover while someone else walked the original out a different door entirely. Sloan said that Dean had failed. She did not say it with anger. She said it with the particular precision of an executive cataloging a performance gap, and that made it harder to answer than anger would have been. Dean did not argue. He asked instead, who knew the briefcase existed? Who had known the evening's schedule? Who had selected the vehicle and the exit route? Sloan listed 5 names without hesitation, the kind of list a person maintains mentally when they run a company built on the understanding that information is leverage. One of the 5 names was Vaughn Maddox. Dean noted this without a word. Tessa said they needed to inform the board immediately. Sloan said they could not inform the board because if the briefcase was gone and the audit had not been presented, Conrad Blackwell would use the missing documentation as a reason to call for her suspension before the morning meeting, and she would have no standing to contest it. Dean said keeping it quiet handed the advantage to whoever had taken the documents. She said that was a strategic opinion, not a security assessment, and that he should focus on getting her home safely. Dean went to inspect the convoy vehicles while Sloan met with Tessa. The primary car was clean. The second vehicle had its navigation software updated remotely within the last hour, quietly redirecting the convoy along a maintenance tunnel with reduced lighting and reduced camera coverage. The third vehicle had an unscheduled driver. Dean found all 3 of these things 11 minutes after Vaughn had cleared the vehicles as ready to depart. He called the convoy off. Vaughn objected loudly. Dean told Vaughn that if the primary vehicle's navigation had been remotely updated, Vaughn could either explain why that was standard or step aside and allow Dean to move the principal by a method no one else had preloaded. Vaughn stepped aside. Dean arranged a service vehicle through the hotel's car service and had Sloan exit through the event coordinator bay wearing a lanyard and carrying a folding table, which was undignified and entirely effective. A camera in the service bay captured everything cleanly, including the timestamp on the lobby elevator footage, showing a figure in hotel staff uniform carrying the real briefcase into the service elevator exactly 10 minutes before the altercation outside. The figure on the hotel footage wore a uniform, a cap, and a posture that was careful without being conspicuous. Dean and Tessa reviewed the footage for 40 minutes in the hotel's security office, which the night manager had opened after a conversation with Sloan that lasted approximately 2 minutes. What the footage showed was not a person being careless. It showed someone who knew which of the lobby's 12 cameras were active and which were on a rotation cycle. It showed someone who chose the service elevator on its low traffic interval. It showed someone who moved through the building the way people move when they have studied the floor plan, not walked it casually. The maintenance schedule for the South Corridor, the blind spot created by the repositioned camera in the lobby, the yellow badge that bypassed the staff credential check near the east exit. These were not coincidences. They were a prepared environment, and the 3 men outside had been its most visible and least important component. Dean told Sloan what this meant in plain language. The attack outside was a distraction, a test, and a timer. Its purpose was to pull every eye toward the lobby entrance, to assess how Dean responded under pressure, and to create exactly the amount of chaos needed to move one object from one part of a building to another without anyone watching the right door. Sloan sat across from him in the 14th floor suite and said that she needed him to understand what was in the briefcase, and then she told him. Internal audit documentation, evidence of inflated contracts across 3 port infrastructure projects, financial flow records from a network of shell companies, and a series of internal emails showing that several project reports submitted to the board had been substantially altered before she ever saw them. She told him there was a board meeting the following morning at 9, and without the documentation, she had a verbal summary and a set of accusations she could not substantiate against people who had spent 40 years building the kind of credibility that makes accusations slide off. Dean asked why there was only one physical copy. Tessa said the auditor, a man named Grant Holloway who had worked for Sloan's father for over a decade, had insisted on keeping the documentation offline because he believed the company's internal servers had been compromised. Grant had delivered the briefcase to Tessa that afternoon and had not been reachable since. Sloane said she was not entirely certain Dean's own history was irrelevant to what was happening. She said the word Calder in the text message on the attacker's phone was not a coincidence, and she said Vaughn had mentioned, when arguing against Dean's placement, that Dean had left his previous employment following what Vaughn called a handling incident. Dean said the incident was 6 years ago and had nothing to do with the briefcase. Sloane said that when someone uses a person's name as a variable in an operation, that person's past is no longer separate from the present operation. She said it quietly, without accusation, and it was the most careful thing she had said to him in 3 days. He didn't answer right away. He reached instead toward the fake briefcase on the table, turned it over, and found along its inner lining a narrow strip of industrial-grade nylon webbing with a color code tag, a logistics inventory mark used in warehouse routing systems. The tag color corresponded to a Harrington Global subsidiary. The facility code pointed to a distribution center on the south side of the city. He photographed the tag and said they had a starting point. Heavy. The photograph arrived on Sloane's phone at 11:47 that evening. A still image of the briefcase sitting on a metal table, the room behind it dim and industrial, and Grant Holloway seated in a folding chair in the background. There was no ransom demand, only an address and a message saying to come before 6 in the morning and to come alone. Dean examined the photograph for 3 minutes before speaking. Grant was not restrained. His hands were visible on the table. The clock on the wall showed 2:15, but the message timestamp was 11:47, a discrepancy of nearly 10 hours. The condensation on the coffee cup beside him could have been staged. Dean said they were looking at 2 possibilities. Grant had made a choice, and this was a setup, or Grant was being used as bait by someone who understood that Sloane would not ignore a man who had served her family for 2 decades. He laid out a plan. They would not approach the address directly. He had identified a building across the street from the distribution center with a clear sight line to the loading bays. Tessa would contact a private investigator to run a parallel chain of evidence through channels Blackwell could not intercept, and they would observe the location before committing to entry. Sloane objected. She said Grant was not a liability. He was a person who had stayed loyal through 3 executive transitions, and she was not going to treat his presence in a photograph as a tactical variable. Dean said he wasn't treating Grant as a variable. He was treating the photograph as one. He told her that protecting someone sometimes meant preventing them from walking into the trap they had already decided to walk into, and that walking into a trap because it felt emotionally obligatory was exactly what the people who said it were counting on. She said fine, in the tone of someone suspending a counter-argument she intended to return to. The distribution center was quiet. They observed it from the building across the street for 22 minutes and saw no guards at the outer entrance, which was wrong. The loading dock lights were on, but the motion sensors at the main pedestrian entrance had not triggered. Dean used a thermal scope borrowed from the investigator's kit and found 2 heat signatures near the north wall and none near the central floor space. The briefcase was on the floor in the center of the room under a single work light, positioned exactly where someone entering through the main door would naturally stand to examine it. 3 cameras were mounted on the walls, all aimed at that central position. Dean said the setup was designed to capture footage of Sloane retrieving the briefcase in an unauthorized location at an irregular hour. Footage that could be framed as evidence of a CEO concealing documents rather than recovering them. He found a signal transmitter mounted behind a support column, its frequency routed to an internal Harrington server address. They left without touching anything. They were walking back to the car when Von Maddox materialized at the end of the block with 4 security personnel and a voice that carried the particular authority of a man who has decided he cannot be wrong. Vaughn said Dean had removed the chief executive from a secured location without authorization, had disabled her tracking protocols, had failed to report his movements to corporate security for over 4 hours, and had now brought her to an unsecured industrial property in the middle of the night. He said he was relieving Dean of his weapon and his assignment effective immediately. Dean set his firearm on the hood of the nearest vehicle without being asked, because the fastest way to prevent a confrontation from becoming a crisis is to remove the element that makes it one, and he had learned that particular lesson at a cost he was still paying. He told Vaughn he had 3 questions. He wanted to know how Vaughn's team had found this location, given that no one had transmitted coordinates, and Sloane's phone had been off since the hotel. He wanted to know who had sent the convoy route update to the navigation system of the primary vehicle. He wanted to know why the attacker outside the hotel had glanced toward Vaughn's position when the police were loading the 3 men into a patrol unit. Vaughn said the company emergency protocol tracked the GPS embedded in Sloane's security credential card. Dean said the card had been in the safe room since 9 in the evening. Tessa said, very quietly, that the coordinates for the distribution center had been sent from Vaughn's administrative account at 11:53. Vaughn said his account had been compromised. The temperature of the room, which was really a loading bay with fluorescent lights humming overhead, dropped several degrees. The building's security system locked all external doors at that moment. The overhead lights extinguished and were replaced by the dim blue of emergency lighting. A wall-mounted camera began a recording indicator, its red light steady and visible. Someone had prepared this moment too. Dean understood it immediately. They were being framed in real time, a group of people in a locked facility in the middle of the night, with a stolen briefcase on the floor and a confrontation captured on camera. He told everyone in the building to stop moving. He said it once, in the flat tone that people use when they have already decided that louder is not more effective, and it worked the way flat tones delivered with certainty usually work, which is to say that it worked on everyone except the 4 people who came through the loading dock's freight entrance with the specific physical posture of people arriving to finish something they'd been paid to start. What followed did not resemble the lobby incident. The lobby had been geometry. 3 positions, 1 principle. A problem that resolved in 8 seconds because the variables were limited. The warehouse was architecture. Multiple sight lines, elevated equipment, shadows created by industrial racking, and a group of people on Dean's own side who needed to be kept out of harm's way more urgently than the opposing group needed to be neutralized. Dean did not engage. He moved. He used a forklift as a barrier, a partitioned section of the racking system to funnel the incoming group through a narrower approach, and a fire door to isolate one corridor entirely, buying enough time for Tessa to reach an emergency call point and for Vaughn, who, whatever his failures, possessed genuine security training, to cover the west exit. Dean restrained 2 of the 4 people when they had no remaining options and sustained a bruised forearm and a cut above his left ear that bled with the cheerful generosity of head wounds, regardless of their actual severity. When it was over and the room was quiet and the police were on their way, Sloane was standing near the forklift watching Dean press his sleeve against his ear without acknowledgement, and she heard one of the restrained men say into his radio, in the dull mumble of a person who has run out of reasons to be careful, "Blackwell wants her alive." Sloane had known Conrad Blackwell for as long as she had memories of men who shaped decisions from comfortable distances. He had been at her father's table throughout her childhood, had occupied the front row at her father's memorial, and wept with what appeared to be genuine grief, and had been the voice in the boardroom who argued most forcefully that she was the right person to lead Harrington Global after the transition. He was 63 years old, and wore bespoke suits and spoke about fiduciary responsibility the way people speak about a faith they expect to keep serving them. He was the last person she wanted to believe was capable of what the evidence was beginning to suggest. Dean told her that the most dangerous person in any structure is not the one who breaks in. It is the one who never needs to, because they already have everything they need to operate from inside. Tessa had spent the past 2 hours running a reverse trace on the ownership chain of the company, registered to the signal transmitter found at the distribution center. The chain passed through 3 holding structures before it landed in a Delaware fund, whose directors appeared much further back in public records, in filings associated with Blackwell Capital Management. The connection was indirect, not proof, but it had the aesthetic of distance maintained by someone who understood that their name in the wrong place costs more than any single transaction is worth. Vaughn, who had been sitting against the wall with the expression of a man accounting for decisions he could not now undo, confirmed that Blackwell had asked him 4 times over the previous 18 months to provide Sloane's calendar and travel itinerary, and that he had complied each time because Blackwell framed the requests as board-level oversight, and because Vaughn had been concealing internal audits showing inadequate security coverage and was not in a position to push back. Sloane asked Dean why the attack team had known his name. He was quiet for a moment. Then he told her. 6 years ago, he had been part of a protective detail assigned to a financial witness scheduled to testify in a federal proceeding involving falsified infrastructure contract data, and the detail had used a route communicated through a contracted security company that was a subsidiary of a Blackwell-affiliated investment group, and the route had been compromised, and the convoy had been intercepted at a tunnel outside Halifax, and a colleague of Dean's had sustained injuries that ended his career in the field. He had left his position 6 months later because he could not reconcile the fact that he had identified the route as a risk and had been overruled by people who decided his instinct was caution and not intelligence. He had not known until that moment in the warehouse that the company that contracted his detail was connected to the same name now appearing in Tessa's records. He said it out loud in a tone that was steady and careful and entirely without the kind of rage the information arguably warranted, because he had carried the weight of Halifax long enough to know that rage was not what it was asking for. He said he now believed his placement as Sloane's bodyguard had not been random. He saw 3 possibilities. His past made him a credible fall guy if the operation went wrong. His history with Blackwell-connected entities was meant to make him reactive and unstable under pressure, or someone with a different interest had placed him specifically to counter what was being planned. He did not know which of the 3 it was. Then Brooke called. The ringtone was the 3rd movement of something orchestral she had set without explaining why, and it played for 3 seconds in the quiet warehouse before he stepped away to answer, and Sloane watched him go with an expression she did not immediately organize into words. Brooke Calder was 14 years old and had inherited from her father the habit of precision in language, which meant that when she said she wasn't angry, it was accurate. She said she knew he was going to apologize for missing the scholarship interview, and she was not going to pretend it didn't matter because it did. But what mattered more was that he tell her honestly why he had taken this job and whether he was going to keep taking jobs like it, because she had spent 4 years watching him manage her expectations in advance of disappointing them, and she was old enough to find that more exhausting than the disappointment itself. Dean stood in the corner of a warehouse with a cut above his ear and said, with more honesty than he had managed in a long time, that he had taken the job because he needed to finish something left unfinished 6 years ago, that he was sorry he hadn't told her that when he signed the contract, and that she deserved the truth more than she deserved to be protected from it. He was quiet for a moment after he hung up. Sloane had moved to stand nearby, not close enough to have heard the conversation clearly, but close enough to have understood its shape. She told him he could go. She said it as a statement of release rather than a dismissal, and the difference was audible. Dean asked her if she was prepared to put the full audit on the table in the morning, the complete version, including the documents that bore her signature on the first project approval. She said nothing. He said that was the answer he had expected. He said he was going to transfer the detail to Vaughn, who despite everything was the known quantity, and asked Tessa to reach the investigator. Then Vaughn said that if Dean left the principal at this moment, the documented record of the evening would show a bodyguard abandoning his assignment after a warehouse incident, which was exactly the narrative that someone had prepared, and that Brooke could participate in the first portion of her scholarship interview from Tessa's office by video link, which was not the same as being in the room but was not nothing. Dean stood for a moment. The idea of accepting help with a problem had been, for him, a long time arriving. He said yes. Brooke participated in the first portion of her interview from a borrowed conference room with Tessa's assistant, sitting quietly in the corner, and Dean sat in the adjoining office with the door ajar and heard his daughter answer questions about her long-term goals with the clarity that made him aware, not for the first time, that the person he most wanted to protect had long since stopped needing that particular kind of protection. He watched her for 4 minutes through the glass partition. Then he went back to work. Sloane was watching him when he returned, and something had shifted in the way she was standing. She told him she was going to put everything on the table. All of it. The board meeting convened at 7 in the morning in a room on the 48th floor of Harrington Global's headquarters. A room that had the particular quality of spaces designed to feel both powerful and inevitable. Conrad Blackwell opened by presenting, in the measured tone of a man performing regret he did not feel, a sequence of events that could not be interpreted charitably. The previous evening's lobby incident involving a bodyguard using physical force on what might have been 3 overzealous security contractors. The CEO's subsequent disappearance from the company's security network, the discovery of the principal in an unauthorized warehouse location with the same bodyguard and a stolen corporate asset, and the apparently deliberate destruction of the chain of custody for a sensitive internal document. He recommended, with what appeared to be reluctant necessity, that Sloane Harrington be suspended pending an independent review, and that Dean Calder's engagement be terminated immediately. The video of the 8-second incident was displayed at reduced speed. The version Blackwell presented opened at the moment Dean's hand closed on the first attacker's wrist. Tessa interrupted to request the complete hotel security footage, preserved under the previous evening's police report. The full recording showed 3 men adopting coordinated positions around the vehicle entry point before any contact had been made. It showed the attacker's phone lit up on the pavement, and it showed, from the repositioned lobby camera, a figure in hotel staff uniform entering the service elevator with a briefcase 11 minutes before the incident outside. Grant Holloway entered the room at 8:52 and presented financial flow records reconstructed from a partitioned backup he had maintained across 3 separate offline storage locations, none of them inside the Harrington Global server infrastructure. Vaughn Maddox provided a written statement acknowledging 4 instances of calendar disclosure to Blackwell and 2 internal security reviews he had suppressed, having consulted an independent attorney overnight. Blackwell had one remaining argument. He placed on the table a single document, the approval form for the first infrastructure project that had subsequently been used as the financial template for the shell company network. It bore Sloane's signature on the executive authorization line. He said she had approved the project that had become the framework for a scheme that extracted funds from the company she ran, and that this raised the question of whether she had been deceived or whether she had been convenient, and that either answer reflected a failure of oversight that the board was obligated to evaluate. The room became very still. Sloane could have said the signature had been obtained under false pretenses, which was true. She could have said the report she had approved was materially different from the project that was executed, which was also true. She said both of those things, and then she said a third thing, which was that she had also created conditions inside the company, where profit projections were reviewed more carefully than the underlying assumptions that produced them, where the reporting structures that should have caught irregularities had been thinned during a cost reduction cycle she had personally approved, and where the culture of not asking difficult questions about numbers that looked good had been allowed to develop because she had not prioritized the kind of skepticism that healthy governance actually required. She said she was distinguishing between a governance failure that was hers and a fraud that was Blackwell's, and that she was not using one to excuse the other. The act of naming her own failure made Blackwell's leverage over it disappear, because leverage requires the threat of revelation, and revelation requires that the thing being revealed has not already been said out loud. The board voted to refer Blackwell's conduct to an independent oversight committee pending regulatory notification. They voted to continue Sloane's tenure in a supervised capacity subject to a governance review. They did not vote to vindicate her because this was not the kind of room where vindication was a motion on the agenda. It was the kind of room where the next step was identified and taken, and the next step was accountability in both directions, which was the closest thing to justice that a boardroom was capable of producing. The meeting ended and the room began to clear, and Dean moved to the elevator bank with the careful attention he gave to every space immediately after a high-stakes event, because the time immediately after a high-stakes event is when people who have been waiting for everyone's attention to relax finally act. He noticed the absence of a security staff member who had been at the entrance checkpoint all morning and who was no longer at his position. He cross-referenced the face with the personnel list Tessa had given him and then with his own memory, and the memory returned something that was not on the personnel list. A face from a file he had reviewed in the aftermath of Halifax, a contractor who had been employed by the same subsidiary that had compromised his convoy route and who had since taken a position as a senior security advisor to a Blackwell-associated entity. Dean moved toward the parking structure. The underground level was quiet. Sloane was walking toward the car with Tessa when the man appeared from behind a structural column, moving with the flat efficiency of someone who had done this work a long time. He was not trying to hurt Sloane. He was trying to reach the drive in her coat pocket, the third piece of the documentation chain, the piece that could not be reconstructed if destroyed. Dean put himself between them and told Sloane to move to the nearest column without turning her back. The man said Dean had made the same error in Halifax and would make it again, that there was always a moment where the choice between the order and the person became inevitable, and that the record would show he failed it twice. Dean said nothing. He kept his weight distributed and his eyes on the man's hands and waited, because patience in proximity is not passivity. It is refusing to give the other person the first meaningful movement. The man committed to a reach rather than a strike, and the reach created a line Dean intercepted without aggression and with enough leverage to conclude the contact in approximately 22 seconds, which was longer than 8 seconds, because this was a man who knew what he was doing, and longer than 8 seconds was still sufficient. The man was alive. The drive was intact. Sloane had not moved from the column. Dean handed the drive to Tessa and called the police and sat down on the ground with his back against the car tire, because his leg was shaking in the way that limbs shake after the body has decided that the threat is over and has sent the bill for what managing it cost. Sloane walked over and sat on the bumper beside him, which was not a thing she would have done 3 days earlier, and did not say anything, which was the right choice. He told her the assignment was concluded. She said she knew. She asked whether he was going to leave. He said that protecting her and working for her were 2 separate decisions, and that the first one he had made on his own, and the second one she was going to have to give him a reason to make. The weeks that followed had the quality of aftermath. Institutional motion combined with human stillness, the slower and more durable work of consequence once the acute phase has passed. Blackwell's position was suspended pending investigation into securities fraud, contract manipulation, and obstruction related to the Halifax incident, which had been reopened after Dean's account, and the newly surfaced documentation established a pattern of deliberate routing. Von Maddox resigned and entered a cooperation agreement providing testimony that prosecutors described as significant. Ryland Crow's legal team negotiated reduced exposure in exchange for the recorded operational briefing, authenticated through audio analysis, and the Halifax reference that identified its speaker's access to a file with 3 known custodians. Grant Holloway was designated a protected whistleblower under federal statute and returned to Harrington Global after an 8-week administrative review. None of this was fast, none of it was clean, but it moved forward, which is the thing that matters most about institutional accountability. Not that it is satisfying, but that it does not stop. Sloane remained CEO under independent oversight. The company suspended the projects under review, commissioned an external governance audit, issued a public disclosure to affected partners, and initiated a restitution process for entities whose contract values had been inflated. The security division was restructured under a reporting chain that bypassed the executive board entirely, with oversight from an independent compliance officer whose appointment required shareholder ratification. Sloane offered Dean the position of Executive Protection Director with full authority to build his own team and a compensation package that signaled institutional seriousness. Dean declined the offer in its original form. He told her the problem had not been a talent deficiency. It had been a system that classified warning signs as interference and treated the people who raised them as obstacles. He said he would consider a 6-month consulting engagement under 4 conditions: independent reporting, a schedule that respected his family obligations, no board override authority over security risk assessments, and a standing right to cancel any public event when a credible risk had not been mitigated. Sloane accepted all 4 without negotiation. She did not apologize, which was something Dean respected more than an apology would have been, because she offered instead the thing that apologies are often used as a substitute for: a commitment to behave differently, demonstrated by the behavior itself. 6 months later, the Harrington Global Security Division operated with a transparency it had never had before. Staff had access to a direct reporting channel that did not pass through executive approval, and Sloane had been reinstated to the full CEO role following a governance review that described her disclosure during the board meeting as a material factor in its assessment of her fitness to continue. The scholarship committee had offered Brooke a finalist position, and Dean attended the announcement in person. He sat in the 3rd row of a school auditorium with his phone in his pocket and did not think about exits for nearly 40 minutes, which was not a record but was progress. Sloane arrived after the event had ended, without a media contingent, without a driver, and without the particular forward lean of a person who has arranged their own arrival to make a specific impression. She was carrying the briefcase. It had been returned following the completion of the evidentiary process, and she had decided after a conversation with Dean that had lasted longer than either of them had planned, that it would be placed in the security training room at Harrington Global Headquarters, not as a display piece, not as a symbol of resilience, and not as a brand asset, just as an object that had been at the center of something that had cost people significantly, mounted on a wall beside a single line of text on a brushed metal plate. The text read, "Every system fails when the truth must be carried by one person alone." Sloane asked Dean whether the 8 seconds was the reason she had trusted him. He said no. He said the 8 seconds was how the story got started. The trust was built from everything that came after, and it was built slowly and conditionally and would stay built only as long as both of them chose to keep building it. She said she understood. He said the 8 seconds was also not what it appeared to be in the lobby that evening. He had not reacted in 8 seconds because he was fast. He had reacted in 8 seconds because he had started reacting 7 minutes earlier when he noticed that 3 people in a crowd were not looking at the woman everyone else was watching. They were looking at what she was carrying. She said that was the part she hadn't seen. He said that was usually how these things worked. By the time anyone was watching the 8 seconds, everything that mattered had already happened in the minutes before it. They walked out of the building into the late afternoon. The light was low and direct the way Chicago light gets in the season when summer is receding but has not yet accepted the fact. Sloane had the briefcase in her left hand. At the base of the steps, she transferred it to her right hand in the absent way of someone adjusting their grip, and for a moment Dean reached toward it out of habit before he stopped himself. She looked at him. He looked at the briefcase and then at her. He said she could carry it. She held it steady and smiled without showing her teeth, the small private smile of a person who has earned something and knows exactly what it cost. And they walked forward together into the kind of afternoon that does not promise anything except that it is still going, and that so are you, the briefcase in her hand and no one standing between her and the direction she had chosen.